you don't hate the government enough and you don't appreciate how much the government actually hates you. ATF is back at it again with pistol braces. Yeah, pistol braces. We thought that issue was settled. But in a court filing in Texas federal court Monday, March 16th, the ATF seems to have made no bones about the fact that it's going to continue to enforce the provisions of the NFA and the GCA against people who have braces on their pistols, and it seems to be a slap in the face of those who fought against their 2023 rule. Let's talk about that today. Welcome back to West Virginia Gun Law. I'm Attorney Todd Leneve. In January of 2023, the ATF issued a final rule asserting that placing a brace on the buffer tube of an AR-style pistol converted that pistol into a short-barreled rifle, or SBR. Initially, when the final rule was proposed, ATF developed a score sheet that had owners looking at various criteria of their firearm, and if the points added up to a certain random threshold number, that meant that the firearm was in fact an SBR and not a braced pistol. So the rule was challenged, and in the course of it coming out, the ATF changed the way that it was going to implement the rule. As a result of that change, numerous lawsuits were filed in federal courts across the U.S. challenging the rule under the Administrative Procedures Act, which is the federal law that basically decides how an agency is able to create a new rule. And it sets forth very specific guidelines and processes that have to be followed if that rule is going to have a chance at becoming an official rule and being valid and able to be enforced. In this case, because the ATF changed the way they were applying their rule, that gave a rise to these legal challenges, basically saying, hey, they failed to comply with the Administrative Procedures Act, therefore the rule should be struck. So the majority of these cases were filed under a challenge under the APA, not through some constitutional or other legal theory challenge, but rather under the APA saying, hey, the ATF didn't do this correctly. So in 2025, a federal Texas judge issued a final vacator, or basically he vacated throughout, nullified that final rule. And that was a nationwide vacator, meaning it didn't just affect the parties in the case in his court, but it affected everybody. He said essentially ATF's pistol brace rule is dead. And so that was mid-2025. Things seemed to be okay for a while. However, there was one case that had continued to be litigated in another Texas federal court. That case was styled as Texas versus the ATF. And I'll have a link to the docket of that case in the description below so you can take a look at it. But even though the final rule had been vacated, that case continued with certain legal challenges and legal maneuvering going on and requiring the court to be involved and keep the case on its docket. Recently, the ATF filed a motion to dismiss that case on the grounds that the case was based on failures under the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, and that because the rule had been vacated, the case was moot or no longer relevant. And so the plaintiffs, the state of Texas, who were backed by Gun Owners of America and some other individuals involved, filed a brief challenging that motion to dismiss the case because they said, hey, there are things that we still need to get resolved here that need the case to remain open. ATF just this past Monday, March 16th, filed a short response, a reply brief that essentially said, hey, no, it doesn't matter what their position is. The rule has been vacated. The only basis for this lawsuit is the Administrative Procedures Act failures. Because the issue has been resolved, this case is ready to be dismissed. And then in the brief, near the end, they took this little stab at the plaintiffs, and really it's not just the plaintiffs, it's the Second Amendment community in general. And they included this language that, if you read into it, maybe read between the lines a little bit, just seems to be that slap in the face that I talked about earlier. Plaintiffs also make much of the fact that defendants continue to enforce the NFA's and the GCA's regulation of short-barreled rifles against some brace-equipped pistols, even though the rule has been universally vacated. But that should come as no surprise, as that is consistent with how defendants have always explained how things work out if a court vacated the rule or enjoined its enforcement. At any rate, the defendants continue to enforce certain statutory requirements and prohibitions that they have been delegated the authority and responsibility to administer is irrelevant to whether plaintiffs' APA challenge to the now defunct rule is moot. Basically, the ATF is saying, hey, you don't like it? Tough. We're still going to do it anyway. Their rationale is that both the Gun Control Act and National Firearms Act are still the law of the land, and that as the administrative agency charged with the responsibility for applying, interpreting, and enforcing those code sections, they have all the discretion they want to decide how they're going to interpret and enforce those code sections. And so as a result, they're saying that their opinion is all that matters. The challenge under the APA was different and unrelated to what they can do in terms of how they choose to interpret and apply the law. And even though in 2012 and 2014, the ATF issued opinion letters stating that adding a brace to a pistol doesn't make it an SBR, firing a braced pistol from the shoulder doesn't make it an SBR, they've now just shown how wildly radical and unpredictable their opinion can be on these things. And they've said, we're just saying abandon all that. We're going to enforce the rule and say that, in fact, these are short-barreled rifles, even though there is no rule, and even though the statutes, the federal statutes, don't actually say that. That's what ATF is doing. So, AG Bondi, where are you on this? Literally, this woman has come out and done some great things in her time as AG for the Second Amendment community, but then turns around the next week and does something like this. It's so completely inexplicable why she would sit back and allow this to happen when this is supposed to be one of the most two-way friendly administrations we've had. The reality is that this administration has not been the Second Amendment friend that it seemed that it was going to be. And while it has done some things that have been helpful for us, it's also allowing things like this to take place that undermine every bit of the concept of shall not be infringed. So, folks, it's real simple. You need to be cautious right now because of this opinion that they've put out in their brief, that they're going to continue to enforce against some braced pistols. You need to be careful about who you're showing your pistols to, what you're doing when you're shooting them, who's around watching you when you're shooting them, making posts, videos, photos on social media of your pistols. You need to be cautious because you don't know what it's going to take for the ATF's attention to decide it's settling on you. Now, an interesting side note here is that in the state of West Virginia, SBRs and brace pistols are absolutely not against the law. They are not outlawed by any state code that we have. And so you may own a braced pistol. Heck, you could even own an SBR here. And a state certified law enforcement officer can't arrest you for that, can't charge you for that, because there is no state law for them to enforce. Enforcement of this issue is strictly for federal law enforcement. And while there aren't a lot of them in any given state, at least here in West Virginia in particular, the reality is that virtually every administrative agency of the federal government has its own police force. In fact, I'm going to put a link in the description of the video to a website where you can check out all of the different federal agencies that have their own police force. As if the FBI wasn't enough, we've got a dozen different police forces that are part of the federal government. So again, the point of this is that a federal agent can, in fact, arrest you and charge you for having a braced pistol because they are currently saying these things are short-barreled rifles. I'm urging you simply to be cautious. Understand that this brief filed Monday by the ATF indicates they aren't done with the rule and they aren't done with enforcing their interpretation, wrong as it may be, of what a short-barreled rifle is. And folks, we're squarely in the crosshairs. So just be careful. Listen, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts on this, and I know already shall not be infringed. It is pretty plain. But please, share your thoughts down below. Do me a favor, hit the like button on this video, share the video. I really want to make sure this word gets out. People are starting to make other videos in social media, and I wanted to get this out to my audience to make sure you guys are aware of what's going on. I appreciate you being here again today, and I look forward to seeing you the next time out. Until then, take care and stay safe.